Chapter 27 this morning. For those who said it couldn't be done, here we are, just on the very nip of the end of our studies of the book of Acts. So we'll have this week, in which we'll cover chapter 27, and we'll have a week off. Next week, as you know, is the congregational meeting, which we will all be attending. And then the week after that, we will finish off our studies of the book of Acts with chapter 28. And so we'll be proceeding from there. I indicated to you last week that really chapter 26, in the minds of many commentators, is really the climactic moment. That's Paul's last great self-vindication when he speaks before Agrippa. And it is a high point, and as we reviewed it, I hope you sensed that in many ways, as Luke was designing this whole book, this was the opportunity to bring it to a grand conclusion as he defends himself before the king. But it would be somewhat abrupt to just leave it there, you know, and so Luke goes ahead and winds down the rest of the story. We have anticipated that Paul would get to Rome. We know that that's what he's wanted to do, and Luke knew that it would be of interest to us to know how he got there, and so he's going to give us the rest of that story. And chapters 27 and 28 fill in that. And really 27 is one of the great pieces of adventure literature that comes down to us from the ancient world. I have to say I can't remember ever hearing a sermon on Acts 27. Now, I don't have perfect recall of every sermon I've ever heard, so I don't want you to hold me to that. But this is not necessarily a text that pastors gravitate to, because there's not a lot here that really invites sermonizing. But it's wonderful adventure, you see. So if you're just up for a great story, this is it. And we have the distinct sense that Luke was right there, that this is not something he concocted, that it certainly was an event of which he was an eyewitness and more, probably much more than he really wanted to be. He was very much a player and participant in this great shipwreck story. And of course, it's by that means that Paul is eventually then brought to Rome. Why is this story here? Well, partly because it happened, and that's probably good enough reason in and of itself. But we know there's a lot of things that happened in Paul's life, some of which were perilous, life-threatening. There was at least one other shipwreck incident that Luke doesn't tell us, so why this? Probably just to show that when God made this promise to Paul that he would stand before the emperor, that God was not going to let anything deter that from happening. That God in his providence, notwithstanding all of the slings and arrows, as it were, of circumstance that were thrown against him, would nevertheless make good on that guarantee. And so we find Paul dealing with a great storm at sea out in the Mediterranean. We find him dealing with soldiers who want to kill the prisoners. We find him dealing with a shipwreck, washing ashore on the island of Malta. We find him being bitten by a snake that should have been a lethal injury. And none of these things prevent God's purpose from being realized. There's great encouragement of that. If God has a design for your life, which he certainly does, if he has a destiny he wants you to fulfill, then nothing is going to prevent you from realizing that as you continue to trust him. So whatever else we learn from this chapter, that's probably an underlying theme that should give us great encouragement. This chapter is a little longer, but it actually goes a little faster, so I think we won't have any trouble making it through the chapter. I just want to make one further comment. I indicated to you a couple of weeks ago, and I'll remind you that when we finish Acts, which will be 2 weeks from today, then we will have about 12 weeks left for our church school year. And we are going to be continuing here in the sanctuary. And the plan is to move from a study of Acts to the Old Testament and launch a study of the 12 minor prophets. And there just so happens that there's 12 of them. So that works out really nice, doesn't it? Speaking of providence, I assume that that's got to be the reason that worked out so well. But we'll take one prophet a week. We're going to race right through them. We'll see how that prophet fits into the ancient historical situation. Obviously, we won't read in their entirety each of these prophets, but we'll take out what hopefully will be the salient features of their message, try to set them into the context of the time, and at least give us a little feel for that. I solicited from you a few weeks ago a title. I said, the minor prophets. Doesn't really pack much wallop. And Jean Pierre came up. And she said, well, how about this title? Major Themes from Minor Prophets. You like that? That's good. So my thanks, I said I was going to share the prophets with her. No pun intended there. But she's been that great contributor of our title. So that's what it's going to be, Major Themes from Minor Prophets. And it starts 3 weeks then from today. All right, we are in Acts chapter 27, and we'll go ahead and read this entire chapter. I don't want to interrupt it by breaking it up, and then we'll go back and work through, in the time we have, the points that we need to comment on. A lot of it is self-explanatory and will require very little from me, but I think it tells itself very well. So page 148, chapter 27, Acts, beginning at verse 1. When it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. Embarking on a ship of Andromedium that was about to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty at Cnidus, and as the wind was against us, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. Since much time had been lost and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor in Crete facing southwest and northwest. When a moderate south wind began to blow, they thought they could achieve their purpose. So they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore. But soon a violent wind called the northeaster rushed down from Crete. Since the ship was caught and could not be turned head-on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run on the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and so were driven. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. And on the third day, with their own hands, they threw the ship's tackle overboard. When neither sun or stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me, and not have sailed from Crete, and thereby avoided this damage and loss. I urge you now to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I worship." And he said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor, all those who are sailing with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we will have to run aground on some island." When the 14th night had come, as we were drifting across the Sea of Adria, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took soundings and found 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took soundings again and found 15 fathoms. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. But when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you've been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive. For not one of you will lose a hair from your heads." After he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then all of them were encouraged and took food for themselves. We were in all about 276 persons in the ship. And after they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. In the morning they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. At the same time, they loosened the ropes that were tied to the steering oars. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the ship aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none of them would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Whew. There we are. So there, friends, is a story. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at it. Father, we're grateful for this, again, a story of adventure, but underneath that adventure we sense once again the great power of your sovereignty and providence in history. We thank you that the purposes that you had put in place for the great apostle were not to be impeded by these mere circumstances of nature. And we thank you that in a similar way, we ourselves rest in that great providential care that brings us to whatever your calling is in our lives. We thank you for it. We pray that our brief review of this text would be honored through the presence of your Spirit as our true teacher. And we give you thanks for it in the name of Jesus. Amen. This, by the way, has been likened by many commentators as a good example of a kind of genre that Luke is using here, which is not unlike what you would find in some ancient historians. So if you read Thucydides, if you read Herodotus, if you read Xenophon, some of the ancient Greek historians, you'll find a similar kind of descriptive language is used, and Luke was manifestly acquainted with them. And while that doesn't suggest there's anything less than truth going on in his text, he nevertheless is using and borrowing that kind of literary style. And so it just adds to the energy of the entire text that he does so. And this really raises the text itself to one of the great examples of ancient kind of adventure literature, such as we'd find in other sources as well. In this case, it just happens to be God's holy word as well that's using that kind of style. So anyway, here at verse 1, when it was decided that we were to sail for Italy, they transferred Paul and the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. The decision presumably made by Festus. Festus, you recall, had been present when Paul made his final argument to Agrippa. Agrippa undoubtedly facilitated and assisted Festus in reducing to writing the indictment that would accompany Paul on his journey to Rome, because Paul would, after all, stand before the emperor, which would be the natural result of the appeal that he had made to the emperor. And Festus sent him on his way, entrusting him to Julius. Julius is a member of the Augustan cohort. That's a division of the Roman army. We hear of the Augustan cohort from Suetonius as well, who's a Roman historian, and mentions that it's one of the most prestigious and honored of the divisions of the Roman military force. And so Julius himself must have been a very competent military character. We also detect here that he's an honorable man. He certainly treats Paul with a great deal of deference and respect throughout. And so, as is common in the New Testament, the centurions always get very good play, if you ever notice that. Roman centurions virtually never are bad guys. They always are good. Even in the life of Jesus, we have a centurion who invested in rebuilding a synagogue. And we have Cornelius the centurion, and this centurion, and others that show up, and they're virtually always honorable people. So it's an interesting thing that we find that, and this is no exception. Embarking on a ship of Andromedium that was to set sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. They're leaving, of course, Caesarea. That's where Festus was. The ship that they're catching is from Andromedium. The current name for that is, somebody knows this, Andromit, I think it is, or Andromen. It's a shortened version of that same name. It's a famous city for shipbuilding in the ancient world. It would be something like our idea of Detroit, associated with cars. So Andromedium was associated with ships, and particularly the high-class ships, good ships that were seaworthy and trustworthy. And so they're put on, we should interpret that as a good, solid ship that would be a safe place for them. From there, they sail off. This ship was headed for the coast of Asia. They're on the coast of Palestine now. They're going to sail north and west, and then this ship will go north again up the coast of Asia for commercial purposes, presumably. And so they jump on board. Aristarchus, we've mentioned him before. He's a traveling companion of Paul. He seems to stay with Paul right down to the bitter end. The last letters that Paul writes, he mentions Aristarchus and calls him a fellow prisoner. Not meaning that Aristarchus was in chains with Paul, but simply voluntarily standing with him. He even says when others had deserted him, Aristarchus was there. And so this is a good man. We never have a word from him in the New Testament, and yet he plays prominently, obviously, in the life of Paul as a source of encouragement. Luke, obviously, is also with Paul. He's an eyewitness to these things. He uses the first-person plural pronoun we in this text, as you noticed. So Luke is there as well. And he describes in such detail the unfolding events that we know that Luke had to have been a first-hand observer of these things. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to be cared for. Sidon is up the coast from Caesarea, 69 miles. Probably took 2 or 3 days. So they make probably a commercial stop there. That is a stop for purposes of taking on cargo, that sort of thing. Paul has friends in Sidon. You recall earlier he visited Tyre right next door. He stayed at the home of Philip and his family. Probably that's the same people that he sees now. The term that Luke uses here, to be cared for, the Greek word is a word that is unique in the New Testament. And in fact, there's several times this happens in the book of Acts, where Luke uses words, and if you read commentaries, you'll see a statement like this. This word is never used any other time in the New Testament, but is common in medical literature. You know how doctors use their own vocabulary? Have you ever noticed that? They have their own special way of talking about things. Luke was a physician. Yeah, some lawyers do the same thing, I know that. But Luke was, by the New Testament description, a physician. And every evidence is that he was a trained physician by first century standards, obviously. And they, as we know today, had their own vocabulary. And Luke frequently uses technical language drawn from the medical profession
which is not otherwise found in the New Testament. And even this particular phrase, to be cared for, as it's translated, is a Greek term that's common in medical literature, unique in the New Testament. Just simply suggests once again that Luke is what he appears to be, and uses that kind of sophisticated jargon to communicate his point. It does suggest medical care, and it implies that Paul may have been under the weather. Now, whether or not he was under the weather because of 2 years in prison or just had a bad cold, we don't know. But there is at least an implication there that Paul was ailing just a bit, and so he's cared for in some sense beyond just general hospitality. Putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So if you have a map in your mind, and by the way, many of your Bibles will have a map. Now, our Pew Bible has a really terrible map back at the first of the book of Acts. But if you have a map and you can follow along, it'll actually help a little bit. But he's sailing up the coast of Palestine, heading for the southern coast of Turkey, and they're going to basically go west along the southern coast. That means they're going to go around Cyprus, the island there off the coast of Palestine. Sailing under the lee of it means simply sailing under its protection from the westerly winds. And so they're sailing in that particular direction. After we had sailed across the sea that is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, that's westward, these Roman provinces, we came at last to Myra in Lycia. Myra is the southernmost tip of the Turkish southern coast, almost a little peninsula that reaches out into the Mediterranean Sea there. So they stopped there and they changed boats. Then the centurion found an Alexandrian ship bound for Italy and put us on board. This is very predictable. This simply shows Luke is giving us a very credible story. There was a triangular route that was the imperial wheat supply kind of route. It went from Alexandria, which was due south of Myra. They would take on wheat from Egypt, from Alexandria, go straight north to Myra, and west to Italy, and then back down to Alexandria. And that was kind of a standard route. And so they're catching a boat that's on its journey there, and it's delivering wheat to Italy. And, of course, they would take passengers as well. So they change boats, and they get on board this Alexandrian ship. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. This is a seaport town right on the southwestern corner of Turkey in the Mediterranean. And from there, it says they sailed under lee of Crete off Salmone. Crete is a major island right in the middle of the Mediterranean. They sailed straight south to go around the south side of Crete, again trying to protect themselves from contrary winds. That was a very standard sea route to follow, and so no surprise there. Sailing past it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens. There is a place that to this day is called Fair Havens on the southern coast of Crete, and that's presumably where they parked, and they were going to stay there at least for a day or two near the city of Lycia. The problem was, verse 9, much time had been lost, and sailing was now dangerous because even the fast had already gone by. The fast is the fast of Yom Kippur. This is in the fall. This is going to be, if this is the year 60, which I'm assuming it is. Some say it's 59. There's a little quibble there. I'm sure I'm right. I think it's 60. And if it was 60, then Yom Kippur was on September 26th. And so when it says we were past the fast, it means we were sometime past September 26th, which means they were probably into October, and the winds tended to get pretty blustery at that point. They certainly were not going to make much more progress. It was too unpredictable, and so that's why Luke gives us that little information that we're even past now that particular time of the year. So Paul stands up, addresses the population on board the ship, saying, quote, "Sirs, I can see that the voyage will be with danger and much heavy loss, not only of the cargo in the ship, but also of our lives." Now, at this point, I think the best opinion is that Paul wasn't reflecting here some kind of supernatural insight. He's not saying, the Lord has revealed to me, that these things will happen. In fact, they did not happen. There was no loss of life. There was loss of the ship and loss of cargo. It seems that what Paul was doing was giving the advice of a seasoned traveler. He'd been here before. He'd been shipwrecked before, at least once. He tells us in 2 Corinthians 11:25 that he was a day and night in the open sea, clinging to something, presumably to stay afloat. We never hear of that incident aside from that passing mention of it by Paul, but Luke never purports to give us the whole story of the life of Paul, and there are gaps out there, and certainly that event took place at some point, and Paul just mentions it. The point is, he'd been at sea many times. He knew what were favorable signs and unfavorable signs, and is probably at this point voicing his opinion along with many others. I think we should stay put. That's Paul's advice. Even though this may not be the best place, we should probably just hunker down, spend the winter here, and go on from there. The centurion, however, verse 11, paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. The bad centurion. Yeah, Luke is being a little critical here. This centurion, this was one time when he missed the bet. But even here, you can really imagine the centurion. He probably likes Paul. He thinks, Paul, you're pretty good at theology. I give you that, but what do you know about, a boat? And he's got experts here. He's got the helmsman. He's got the owner of the ship. These people have done this many times. They're encouraging him to go on. So the centurion probably lamented this decision later, but at the moment he listens not to Paul but to these others. Since the harbor was not suitable for spending the winter, the majority was in favor of putting to sea from there on the chance that they could somehow reach Phoenix, where they could spend the winter. It was a harbor of Crete facing southwest and northwest. In the first century, there was this really beautiful harbor on the western side of the island of Crete. It was a semicircular harbor. It's not there in quite the same way anymore because there was an earthquake in about the 6th century that kind of changed the landscape a little bit. But at the time, it was a beautiful harbor. There were 2 inlets, and it did in fact face kind of northwest and southwest, just as Luke describes it. Many ships would spend the winter there. It was really situated for that, and so there was a hope that they could make it there, and that would be a reasonable thing to attempt, were it not for the weather becoming more and more unpredictable. Well, verse 13, when a southern wind, a south wind, began to blow, a moderate wind, they thought they could achieve their purpose, and so they weighed anchor and began to sail past Crete, close to the shore, hugging the shore. Southerly wind is going to blow them sort of, to the island, so they can navigate their way around, and then it'll blow them up the western coast to this harbor. And so they think that, they're going to achieve their purpose, and everything seemed to be fine. But, verse 14 then, soon a violent wind called the northeaster rushed down from Crete. This is also sometimes called the Euroclidean. In fact, it may be translated that way in some of your texts. It was a cyclical wind. It was typical in the Mediterranean then and now, a kind of cyclonic wind, not a hurricane, not anything that severe, but it did have a tendency to make travel by sea extremely hazardous. And where they were situated, obviously it was blowing them away from Crete, away from the island, out toward the sea. And so this put them in a bit of stress. Verse 15, since the ship was caught and could not be turned head on into the wind, we gave way to it and were driven. And so they do what probably we would have to do at that point, rather than trying to fight your way back to the shore, which would be extremely hazardous under those circumstances. They just say, okay, we're going to let the wind carry us. And they just let it blow them out to sea and hope for the best. By running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. Cauda is a little island about 25 miles off the coast of Crete. No place there to land, but they were able for a moment to find protection from the wind by sailing under protection of that island, and that allows them to secure what's called the boat. That was the dinghy, or the skiff. It's a little sort of like a rowboat, a large rowboat that would be drug along behind the ship, used to ferry back and forth to the shore when the ship would harbor somewhere. Well, they didn't want it out in the open water during this storm, and so while they're in that moment of protection from the island of Cauda, they reel that boat in and get it on deck. So this, remarkable detail here. Luke is giving us this, and you almost sense that he had to have been there observing all this just to give us that kind of interesting detail. So verse 17, after hoisting it up, they took measures to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run onto the Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor, and so were driven. All right, so they hoist this boat up onto the ship, the skiff, the dinghy, up onto it, and then they're fearing running into the Syrtis. Now, that's a sort of a bunch of sandbars that were on the north coast of Africa, and it was a very hazardous place for ships to get trapped because they would run aground and be beaten to death in the storm, and so it was a well-known hazard, and that's exactly where the wind was blowing them, straight toward that region in North Africa. And so what to do? Well, they lowered what's called a sea anchor. That's not quite the right name. This is as if Luke was trying to remember what that was called sometime later. And so he gives us a descriptive term. There was a proper term for it that I can't give you now at this point either, but this was like a drag. They would throw this large floating thing into the water. It was not an anchor that sank to the bottom, but would simply slow them down, so that as they were blown by the wind, they wouldn't be blown as quickly. So it was like something that just drugged them, slowed them down in the water, and Luke calls it a sea anchor, kind of an attempt to describe it, you see, and there was another technical word that was actually would have been its proper name. He was a doctor, by the way, not a sailor, so he's doing a pretty good job here for not being a professional seaman. We were being pounded by the storm so violently that on the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. This was a ship laden with wheat. They're not going to throw it all overboard, but they're trying to lighten up. The boat is probably taking on water, and that obviously is a hazardous situation, so they're going to get rid of at least some of this cargo in the hope of maintaining the buoyancy of the boat. And on the third day, with their own hands, and some readings are our own hands, which may be preferable, we threw the ship's tackle overboard. Some of the tackle, the equipment that wasn't being used was heavy. They threw that overboard as well. Obviously, this is being viewed as a perilous moment, that this is extraordinary measures are now warranted given the threat mounted by the elements. Verse 20, when neither the sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest raged, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. The fact that they couldn't see the sun or the stars simply means they had no clue where they were. That's the way you navigate in the ancient world, and they didn't have GPS, and so they were just sitting there. They saw lots of water, but had no idea where they were, and the Mediterranean is a pretty big place. So they finally were abandoning hope that they would ever be rescued, and probably abandoning hope that they would ever survive this incident at this point. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, I love this, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete, thereby avoiding this damage and loss. Paul is, whatever else he is, he's human. And he cannot resist the temptation to say, I told you so, and so here it is. Guys, I told you, but not to just, rub them in it, as it were. He nevertheless has a great word of encouragement that he brings to them in verse 22. I urge you now to keep up your courage. These people were despairing at this point. Keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. For last night there stood by me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, and he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And if there's any little, Christian or spiritual lesson that we can grab onto in this text, it's probably right here. This was Paul receiving word from God himself that God's purpose was not going to be thwarted even by this very significant apparent threat to their well-being and so on. And I'm sure that these sailors probably, these were hardened men of the sea, and nevertheless at this point, they were happy to hear that. Whether they were Christian believers or not, very unlikely, but at this point they're going to cling to any word of hope they can, and this probably came to them as a great message of comfort in the midst of otherwise very unhappy circumstances. So he says, keep your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have told, but we must run aground on some island. Of course, we learn in the next chapter the island that they did run aground on is called Malta. If you're up on your history of the Second World War, you know that Malta was a major Allied outpost right in the middle of the Mediterranean, south of Sicily. And we gave a lot of grief to the Axis powers during those years because we were never dislodged from Malta. So that's a real place, and that was the island that Paul had foreseen by God's illumination would be the place where the ship would land. All right, verse 27 then. When the 14th night had come, we were sailing across the Sea of Adria. About midnight, the sailors suspected that we were nearing land. If you have the map of this region in mind, you know that between Asia and Greece is the Aegean Sea. Between Greece and Italy is the Adriatic Sea. In the ancient world, the region south of the Adriatic Sea was called the Sea of Adria. So it's not within it's not between those two peninsulas, but it's immediately beneath them, south of that region. So they're blowing, into the region that's south of Italy here, and that's the Sea of Adria. We hear that the sailors suspected they were nearing land. Probably what they heard was the breakers on the shore, the waves hitting the shore, and these seasoned sailors have a kind of sixth sense. They hear that when others may not have, and so they begin to suspect that they're nearing land of some description. So they took soundings, depth soundings, and found 20 fathoms. 20 fathoms is 120 feet. So that means it's not as deep as it might have been. They waited a little further. They took soundings again and found 15 fathoms, 90 feet. They probably waited about a half an hour. That's about how long it would take in that region for the depth of the ocean to change that much. Fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So these sailors get lots of religion at this point as well. They throw the anchors down on the stern. It was typical to throw anchors off the bow of the boat, the bow, and at this point they're rather throwing them off the stern, the back of the boat. The reason, of course, is because they want the boat facing straight to the shore. They don't want to have to turn it around in the morning, and so they do something unusual here. Their hope is to just run this boat right to the shore once they can see where they're going and hopefully escape the storm that way. Verse 30, but when the sailors tried to escape from the ship and had lowered the boat into the sea on the pretext of putting out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Apparently the sailors now, somewhat less than responsible with their fiduciary duties, are just going to escape. They're going to jump in that same dinghy we mentioned and head for the shore and leave these other people on the boat to face whatever prospects they may have. Paul, of course, detecting what's going on, warns the centurion, you better stop those guys. All of us are put at risk if they escape. And so the soldiers, somewhat precipitously, this probably wasn't Paul's intention, but they just walk over, use their swords, cut those ropes, and that dinghy drops into the water, never to be heard from again, So that was the solution to that. The soldiers cut away the ropes of the boat and set it adrift. All right, verse 33. Just before daybreak, Paul urged all of them to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've been in suspense and remaining without food, having eaten nothing. Probably overstating it. This is probably hyperbole. They'd probably eaten something, but, if you've ever been at sea in a storm, you don't feel like eating very much, that, and I'm sure that even these guys were kind of feeling the storm now, these many days, and so they'd at least, probably at most had eaten very little, piecemeal. Much of the food had probably been ruined by the salt water that was splashing into the boat and so on. And so in any event, at this point, Paul is urging them, because they're now on the brink of making it to safe harbor, that they should eat some food to give them some strength. So I completely lost my place. Where am I? Verse 35, thank you. 34, I think, is where we're going to think. Therefore, I urge you to take some food, for it will help you survive, for none of you will lose a hair from your heads. Then verse 35, after he had said this, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Doesn't that sound very much like the Eucharist? It's been noted many times how Luke almost obviously, purposely uses Eucharistic language here. Paul took bread, broke it, gave thanks, distributed, take and eat. And I have a feeling for the Christians with Paul, this was a communion service. And even for those who were just on the ship and they were just eating the bread, they had to have been impressed with the dignity and the courage and the cool-headedness of this Christian man who had been such a source of remarkable insight and encouragement to them. And so a very Christ-like moment here again at this moment. All right, so they took the bread, they ate it. There were 276 persons in the ship. In other words, it was a very good-sized vessel with a goodly number of people on board. After they had satisfied their hunger, they lightened the ship by throwing the wheat into the sea. There was, right around the turn of the century, a man by the name of James Smith. And he was very familiar with the Mediterranean and always been fascinated with this text. And actually went and tried to determine whether he could reproduce the experience of Paul here, whether this was really a credible story. And he retraced all the steps, and he wrote a book about it. So if you, I'm sorry I can't give you the title of the book, but James Smith is the author, and he writes this book. It's probably written about 1890. But one of the things that he points out is how all of the distances here make sense. If this boat was being blown along in a pretty good wind on the Mediterranean, it would make about 36 miles a day. And if you went 36 miles a day for 14 days from Crete, you would wind up about 1 mile from Malta, you see. So the distance here is remarkable in terms of its accuracy. And then the description of the island itself is quite striking as well. In the morning, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. There is a bay on that little island of Malta that is called St. Paul's Bay, and named after St. Paul, obviously, in this particular incident. And it seems highly probable that that is exactly where they landed. The description that's provided here matches with a high degree of accuracy the actual layout of that bay. So, they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. They didn't weigh the anchors back into the boat. They just left them there. And at the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the steering oars to give them a little navigability. And they put up one little sail. So they tied the hoisting the foresail to the wind they made for the ship. One little sail right up front, dropped the anchors, and hoped that the wind is just going to blow us right to the shore, to that nice little sandy beach there, was the hope. But striking a reef, they couldn't have seen that, but in fact there is very shallow reefs that would have, in fact, stopped a boat the size of the one that they were on. They ran the ship aground. So they weren't able to make it to the shore, even though that's what they were trying. They ran aground on this reef. And so the bow stuck and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the force of the waves. The ship, of course, had taken quite a punishment already in the sea, and now the waves are beating on its stern, and it looks like it's going to fall apart there. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that none might swim away and escape. This, of course, was standard Roman procedure. You recall the Philippian jailer thought that prisoners had escaped and was about to kill himself, because he would face worse than that when he was tried for letting prisoners escape. These Roman soldiers were trained, if prisoners escape from your charge, you're in big trouble. And so rather than face the prospects of that eventuality, they're going to take the lives of these prisoners. Julius, however, is, of course, watching out for Paul at this point. So verse 43, the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest to follow, some on planks and others on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. And they were brought to the land, which is this little island of Malta. It's about just south, probably about 50 miles of Sicily. And that is where they wind up, and that's where we're going to leave them in the storm. And we'll pick up next time. Let's pray. Father, we are grateful that you continue to show us the way in which you are a mighty God. And even these elements which were so threatening were utterly within your care and your providence. And we know that to that degree and with that same high degree of confidence, we can look at the elements that confront us, whatever they might be, and realize that they are well within your care, that there is no threat that overwhelms you. And so we cling to you with great confidence and joy, thanking you for this opportunity to review this great moment in the life of the apostle, asking your continued blessing on us now. In the name of Christ.